Our speaker today is Charron, who is a PhD candidate in geography and has spoken here actually before on identity in Crimea. And so, given the research efforts that he's conducted and sort of the direction of his research, I asked him to come in and give us sort of an update on the situation in Crimea.
Thank you, Bart. Yes, and I have given something of a similar presentation to this before. I've talked about some of the same data that I got in a survey there in 2011 that I'll be discussing today, but I'm going to be fleshing it out with some discussion of what's been going on in Crimea in the past year. So I'm going to do a few things in this presentation. I'll first sort of give a brief historical background on Crimea, so I'm sure we're all on the same page. And then I'm going to go over some of the developments that have occurred since the annexation happened just over a year ago now. And then I'm going to switch to sort of talking about some of the narratives that have been used to justify that move by Russia to go ahead and annex Crimea and sort of push back against some of the things that have been, some of the ways that Crimea has been constructed as a place that's inherently Russian and a place belonging to Russia. And I'm going to use some of my survey data that I collected there in 2011 to talk about that. So to begin, just give you a background. I'm sure by now most people here are familiar with Crimea and where it is and what's been happening there to some degree. But just a brief overview here, right? So this is where we're talking about, this peninsula, attached very tenuously to Ukraine there, and barely not attached to Russia on the other side. So sort of right there in the middle. And there's actually two administrative regions that we're talking about here. The first is when it was still part of Ukraine, or recognized as part of Ukraine by everyone, it was the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. Now within Russia, it's dropped the autonomous part, and it's just the Republic of Crimea. Right? There's certainly some symbolism in that, the fact that autonomous no longer falls at the beginning of that title. But it has a population, according to the last Ukrainian census of 2001, of just over 2 million. Well, 60% of that is Russian, about a quarter Ukrainian. 12% Crimean Tatars, this indigenous Turkic-speaking Muslim group, and about 5.4% other minority groups. City of Sevastopol here, separate administrative unit. You can see it, its borders there. This is was a federal city in Ukraine, is now still considered a federal city within Russia by their laws. And it's a city of close to 400,000. It's much more predominantly Russian. Over 70% of the population of Sevastopol is Russian. Similar numbers of Ukrainians, about 22%. Much fewer Crimean Tatars, very few who actually live there, but I believe there are more Belarusians who live in Sevastopol than Crimean Tatars, according to that census. And again, some other groups too. So these are the areas. And I threw up just some maps here very quickly to show that Crimea has been incorporated into many different kingdoms. It's been the site of many different civilizations over the millennia. It was a Greek colony, or had Greek colonies on it way back during the period of ancient Greece. The Scythian Empire was there, the Roman Empire had a colony there, the Khazar Empire, the Goths were there, the Mongols were there, the Golden Horde came through later. So it's been an area that has been sort of a crossroads of people. Now it's kind of a cliche, but it's true. It's an area that has seen many waves of settlement and conquerors, and many of these groups that have been throughout all these periods have sort of left their imprint, and people from these groups have sort of stayed behind in little pockets throughout its history. Just want to go over some key historical dates in Crimea that'll come up again. Right, from 1478 to 1774, it was under the rule of the Crimean Khanate. This was sort of the successor to the Golden Horde. It sort of broke off. It was run by the Khan in the city of Bakhchi-Sarai, who was sort of a descendant of the rulers of the Golden Horde. It was under their rule that many different people kind of came together who had been left over in Crimea over the millennia and formed this Crimean Tatar ethnic group under the rule of the Khan, using the Crimean Tatar language started becoming the common language of these people, with Islam becoming the common religion. And it was at this time that these people first started to coalesce as a coherent group. In 1783, the Crimean Khanate was annexed by the Russian Empire under Catherine the Great. It had actually been under strong Russian influence since 1774, but in 1783 it was formally annexed and incorporated into the Russian Empire. In 1853 to 1856 was the time of the Crimean War. It was a war fought on the one side by the Russian Empire against a coalition of England and France and the Ottoman Empire, sort of vying for control in the Black Sea region, with much of the fighting taking place on Crimea itself. And the city of Sevastopol that I mentioned was the base of the Russian Navy, still is today, the Black Sea Fleet. But as a very strategic location, it was the site of major devastation. It was blockaded, destroyed by the enemy forces, and was completely rebuilt after the war. The city was again destroyed during World War II, during the German occupation of Crimea. Right, Sevastopol resisted the German invaders much longer than the rest of Crimea, and it again was leveled to the ground by fire from the enemies, the Germans seeking to conquer it. And so today Sevastopol bears the scars of both these major periods of devastation. In 1944, after the Soviets recaptured Crimea from the Germans, all of the Crimean Tatars were rounded up en masse and deported by cattle car to Central Asia primarily, but also parts of Siberia. They were deported for supposedly having collaborated with the German occupiers during the war. This was what Stalin had accused them of, and as a form of punishment, rounded them up and sent them into exile. About 42% of the Crimean Tatar population died just en route to their period of exile, right? And I'll talk more about their experience in exile a little bit later on, but without the Crimean Tatars there in Crimea, the region loses its autonomous status, because it had been an autonomous republic for the sake of this ethnic minority group. Without them there, it was home only to Russians and Ukrainians, and no longer constituted a region of a distinct ethnic minority. It became an oblast. In 1954, the oblast, which had been part of the Russian SFSR, the Russian part of the Soviet Union, was transferred to the Ukrainian part. Right? It's become a very controversial moment. It was under Khrushchev, who made the order. Many now say it's illegal, it was done improperly, that it never should have been transferred. Many have been bitter over the fact that it put many ethnic Russians, as we'll see, into Ukraine. It's been the source of a lot of resentment for years, and it's been now in the last year that they've sought to rectify that mistake as they see it. And then during the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapses, Crimea becomes a part of an independent Ukraine. Right? There's a period of unrest and the specter of violence is there in the early 90s. They see regions like Abkhazia, Transnistria, other regions with sort of ethnic conflicts erupting into violence. There's a fear that something similar is going to happen in Crimea for much of this time. There are many separatist movements, Russian nationalist movements occurring in this period. And it's over a long period of several years. It takes until 1997 for negotiations between Kiev and Simferopol, the capital of Crimea, to sort of reach an agreement on the terms of their autonomy within Ukraine. So it's this long period of negotiation and deliberation about how Ukraine is going to look with this region that's still a part of it. Also during the beginning of the very late 80s and into the 1990s, the Crimean Tatars are finally allowed to return from exile for the first time. They've been barred from returning for virtually the entire Soviet period since their deportation. All right, so those are the main events that you need to be aware of, right? But then, as we get to the last year, right? I'm sure I don't need to go into too many details about the Euromaidan. This is something I'm sure most of us have kept up on to one degree or another, aware of some of the implications, but I want to just throw in a few important dates from last year, just over a year ago, as they pertain to Crimea. So it was February 23rd that the Euromaidan sort of came to its violent climax, right? President Yanukovych flees from Kiev, ultimately ending up in Russia, and sort of a new governing coalition is formed. And we now know by Putin's own admission that it was this event and the fleeing of President Yanukovych that triggers puts a plan in place to move to seize Crimea, to seize this area that has a Russian majority, that is seen as being very opposed to the new coalition that's come to power in Ukraine, an area that's been opposed to many of the goals of the Euromaidan. And so, only a few days later, on February 27th, these little green men, as they've been dubbed, begin showing up on the streets of Crimea. Right? They're not wearing any insignia. There's no indication of where they are actually from and who they're actually taking orders from, although many of us figured at the time, and we know for certain now, that they were Russian special troops operating under direct orders of Putin. All right? And so they show up, they seize the airports in the region, they seize various military facilities, they also seize the Supreme Council building in Simferopol, and force the deputies to basically dissolve the government and to install a new government that's essentially a Russian puppet government in Crimea, under the leadership of former deputy Sergei Aksyonov, who's from a pro-Russian bloc of the council that had received about 4% of the population in previous votes. So not a popular politician by any means before he'd been installed and propped up by the Russian invaders. So the new government declares a referendum on Crimea's status. They say we're going to hold this referendum, we're going to let the people decide whether they want to stay with Ukraine or become a part of Russia. So this referendum happens on March 16th, right? Both in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol. Right? This is, by all accounts and by all terms, a sham of a referendum. I've heard it referred to as a Potemkin referendum, right? Sort of putting up a facade of there being, some form of properness or legitimacy happening here. But it's a referendum that is organized just in a matter of weeks. Right? The ballot gives them no option to maintain the status quo. Right? The two options were to join the Russian Federation or to reinstate the 1992 Crimean Constitution, which was a very short-lived constitution that gave Crimea a wide degree of autonomy and basically gave them the right to declare independence and to secede from Ukraine of their own volition. So many saw this as basically a choice between join Russia now or join Russia later. Right? It was held under foreign military occupation. Of course, these little green men were still in place. Right? The only observers to be invited during this referendum were sort of a motley crew of far-right European politicians from various countries who were sympathetic to Putin and to sort of Russian interests and to their ambitions in Crimea specifically, right? So, by all means, this is not a legitimate referendum, but as we'll see, it returned overwhelming support for the idea of joining Russia. All right, so it was only 2 days later, March 18th, that Putin actually signed the Treaty of Accession of the Republic of Crimea to the Russian Federation, making the annexation of Russia complete and legal by Russian law. Right, here are the results. Right, you can see official results within the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol. Over 95% in both cases voting to join the Russian Federation, with measly 2.5, 3.4% voting for the second option, right, essentially joining Russia later. And with voter turnouts, it would be the envy of any democracy in the world to see voter turnouts this side, right? Over 80%, close to 90% in Sevastopol. Right, so people, by all accounts, voted with great fanfare, right? You see these women with their little Russian flags as they're putting their ballots in the boxes. So celebrations on the streets in Simferopol and in Moscow celebrate this grand reunification of Russia and Crimea. Right, so I want to go into a few of the developments. What's happened in Crimea since then, in the last year. This is right, we're just over a year since this has happened. There have been many things that have changed in Crimea. A few positive, we could say, but mostly negative by my assessment, so I'll go over these. So on the positive side, we could say that pensions and salaries for many public sector government employees haven't been increased, right? They've been increased to meet the standards of those within Russia. Ukrainian averages have been much lower, so the retirees here, the old timers, are pretty happy about that. This isn't them celebrating that specifically, but you get the idea. And public transportation costs, I've heard, have gone down. Right? Here's a shot from inside of Marshrutka, right, with sort of the costs in rubles. Right? Of course, they've adapted the ruble. They've switched to Moscow time. They've been very much integrated into Russia. So there's some positive, economic outcomes here for the people, if you want to see it that way. The federal government of Russia has also pledged about $15 billion in investment and subsidies over the next 5 years. So they've really made this pledge to really invest in Crimea and to prop it up. They've diverted projects for infrastructure, oil development, and other projects they've had lined up in other parts of Russia. They diverted those funds to Crimea. Right? They're really making Crimea the top priority. Right? Much of this is going to developing the infrastructure. We see a recent major sinkhole that developed in a road near Sevastopol. This isn't typical, but the roads are fairly bad on the whole, as you might imagine. Right? But also healthcare and education have been a priority for the new subsidies going to Crimea. It's also said to become a special economic zone within Russia, giving investors tax incentives, tax exemptions, in order to encourage them to start investing in Crimea and building and developing there. There's also plans to turn it into a destination for gaming and gambling. They're going to sort of lift some of the restrictions on casinos that are in place throughout much of Russia to sort of try to lure more people to Crimea, to make it this little Monaco on the Black Sea or something like that. Yet, for all these promises, for all these big ideas that they want to, the direction they want to move with Crimea, Crimea's once thriving tourism has taken a major blow in the past year, as you might suspect. Right, this was once the premier Soviet tourist destination, Even within the post-Soviet period, it was a destination for millions of tourists from Ukraine, from Russia, from Belarus, from all over the region. But last year, it had decreased by about 35% from the previous year. And the fact that it's only decreased by that much and not more probably has to do with the fact that Russia has greatly encouraged its people to take their vacations in Crimea, to do their patriotic duty, to go to the new returned piece of the homeland, and to spend their money there instead of in Egypt or in Turkey, places that they might have gone to vacation otherwise. All right, so we see some empty beaches there, and this has been a serious blow to the local economy. Right, and related to this is the fact that it's now very difficult to get to Crimea. Right, there have been the rail links, the airline links from Ukraine and from other countries outside of Russia have been severed. Right, you can no longer take a train to Crimea from within Ukraine. Right, this you can go by car or by truck. Right, the roads are still open, but there's a new border crossing there, and it's heavily guarded. It's a lot of bureaucracy put in place there. A lot of time needs to be spent now to cross that border. So here's a line of trucks waiting to get into Crimea from Ukraine. We can see a picture of some empty shelves in the stores here now. There's far fewer products getting there in a timely manner. There are shortages of various types of foods, of consumer goods throughout the region now. Right? The only real way to get there from Russia, besides flying, is to go across the Strait of Kerch, right? That little narrow place to the east of Crimea that barely doesn't touch Russia. And there's a ferry link, but until recently, it had never been a major thoroughfare for either transporting goods or for transporting people. Now it's been put under tremendous strains just to be able to transport people from Russia to their new exclave here. So these are lines lining up to try to get on this ferry. Right? Meanwhile, the United States and other Western countries have put sanctions specifically on Crimea in addition to the sanctions that they've leveled against Russia. So they've barred a lot of Western companies from doing business there. So companies like MasterCard, PayPal, Visa, Apple, a lot of big tech companies no longer are operational within Crimea. You can't use your credit cards there. You can't access your Google accounts. You can't access your GoDaddy accounts apparently. So it's they've been severed digitally, severed from the internet as much as they've been severed from the physical world outside as well. And here I've got a picture of a dry canal in the north of Crimea. This is the North Crimean Canal, which brought water from the Dnieper River in Ukraine to Crimea. It was a major source of water, and Ukraine has stopped providing water to the region. They've stopped providing electricity as well. And so the domestic resources they have for these water resources, electricity resources, are now put under tremendous strain, and Russia's sort of scrambling to try to provide them with those resources too. So there have been a lot of really big logistical problems in forcefully separating this region from Ukraine and from much of its infrastructure that it been linked to it with through. Right, here's a map of the image of the proposed bridge plan. Russia has moved forward with a plan to invest several $billions into a bridge, finally, for the first time linking the Russian mainland to Crimea. So here's the infographic about this, right? Here's I zoomed in here, that's Crimea, that's the Russian mainland there. If you zoom in, this is where the ferry route goes, and they're actually going to be building a bridge down here, using this little island called Tuzla Island. That's sort of a waylay point for the bridge across there. It's not surprising that the contract for this bridge has been given to one of Putin's buddies, right? We can fully expect to see a lot of that money being invested in it to disappear into his pockets and into the coffers of his company, much like we saw with the Sochi Olympics. Okay. Crimea has also become heavily militarized, right? Those little green men, those special forces used to seize Crimea have stuck around and sort of been given official status. They still maintain a very highly visible and menacing force. I heard that they can still be seen on the streets in Simferopol and Sevastopol, just sort of keeping the peace, as it were. There have also been some 100 military units that have been formed in the region since annexation, right? There was already the naval base in Sevastopol, so there was already a Russian military presence there, but they've incorporated the whole peninsula now. They're really amping up their military presence there. They've also been, it includes about 100,000 people in total, for 100,000 military personnel. There's also been signs and signals that they plan on deploying nuclear weapons to Crimea, or at least suggesting that they have the right to, and it's their prerogative they choose to do it. Here's a quote from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Right, Crimea has now become part of a country that has such weapons under the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. And by international law, the Russian state has all grounds to dispose of its legitimate nuclear arsenal in accordance with its interests and in accordance with its international legal obligations. Right, so it's sort of, fancy way of saying that we intend to arm our newly acquired region with nuclear weapons to keep you all away. All right, Russia has banned all Ukrainian television media within Crimea, and many independent journalists have been threatened, they've been beaten, they've had their equipment confiscated, and they've been or otherwise banned from even entering Crimea. So there's a very dire situation in terms of free press and free media. Also, in about less than 4 hours from now, at midnight, Crimea time, again, remember, also Moscow time, the only Crimean Tatar news organization in the world, as it were, ATR, is set to be shut down because they have been harassed by Russian authorities. They've needed to re-register their organization under Russian law. They have been their applications for this registration have been repeatedly turned down, citing typos and errors in the application, using all these bureaucratic tools to prevent them from staying open and from keeping to the broadcast. Right? The Sergei Aksyonov, the new leader of Crimea, has said that the channel is intentionally turning in their application with mistakes in order to bring attention to the issue, and he's just calling it a provocation, which is a pretty insane, way of twisting the truth here. So this, we're T-minus about 3.5 hours until this is most likely going off the air. All right, Russian authorities have also engaged in various forms of sort of historical revisionism in terms of how they view Crimea and what's allowed to be said there. They've banned many Ukrainian language and Crimean Tatar language books. Right, they've banned books that make mention of the Holodomor, right, the mass starvation of Ukrainian peasants during collectivization in the 1930s. Right, they have also erected a monument in Yalta, of course, home of the site of the famous meeting with Stalin and FDR and Churchill here, right? So they've put in a big statue of the three of them meeting based on that famous picture of them all sitting together, which seems harmless enough, right? It's a big historical event, it's something to commemorate, but the fact that there's now a monument of Stalin sitting in Crimea, the home of the Crimean Tatars, the very people that he had deported, right, is a major insult to the Crimean Tatars, and they've really done the most that they can to protest this move, but they're really powerless in the matter here. There's also been some talk among certain people to revive the old Russian term Tavrida for a name of Crimea. Crimea derives from an old Turkic word, Krim. This is also the name that the Crimean Tatars use for the region, so it's seen as being a foreign word and sort of the more virulent forms of strains of Russian nationalism. I said that we should be applying this old Russian name. So Vladimir Zhirinovsky, of course you all know the ravenous Russian nationalist in the Duma, has been one of the people supporting this idea. All right, Ukrainian language education has also been removed from the school curriculums there. All right, virtually all religious organizations in Crimea, except for the Russian Orthodox Church, of course, have run into all these bureaucratic problems with trying to re-register themselves as a religious organization within the Russian Federation. Right, this has threatened their very presence within the region and their right to continue operating there. All right, authorities have also labeled much of Islamic literature as extremist, right, falling into line with some of the restrictions on extremist literature within Russia itself, and those found possessing it are often fined or have it confiscated or worse. Right, so, speaking to that point, the Crimean Tatars have fared the worst of any group in the region in the past year. Their leaders, their two most prominent leaders, we've got Rafat Chubarov, current president of the Mejlis, their National Assembly, and former leader Mustafa Jamilov here. Both of them have been barred from entering Crimea for at least 5 years. Right? They now sort of reside in Kiev and run their operations from there as best they can. And this organization, the Mejlis, has been threatened with dissolution by the Russian authorities. It labels them as extremists, as provocateurs. And so there have been serious threats to their continuing existence as well. They've also confiscated their building, raided their documents, taken their computers. Right, and there's special troops in front of it right there. That happened several months ago. They've also been forbidden from holding their annual commemoration of the 1944 deportation. They commemorate every year on its anniversary, May 18th. Last year, it was, this would have been only a few months after the annexation. They were forbidden from having their big demonstration, their big commemoration in the main square in Simferopol. And I'm almost certain that the same case is going to happen this year, that they won't be allowed to hold this meeting. Right? There have also been many cases of Crimean Tatars having been harassed and beaten, or otherwise disappeared, or in a few cases found murdered and tortured throughout Crimea. So Crimean Tatars, above all other groups, now live in a fear, an atmosphere of fear, an environment of fear under Russian-controlled Crimea now. So all told, Crimea has seen numerous human rights abuses in the past year. Right, so Freedom House is sort of non-governmental organization, watchdog organization that sort of ranks countries and regions of the world according to different indexes of freedom, right? Freedom of the press, civil liberties, political rights. They, for the first time in 2015, evaluated Crimea separately from Ukraine, or whatever country you might consider it in now, and gave it a score of not free, right? With 7 being the worst in all these categories. They're right down there with some of the worst countries in the world, with the worst offenders of denying freedoms throughout the world. So you can see pictures here, right? Crimean Tatars being harassed by special forces here. So it's become a very, very dire situation, as you can see. Additionally, some 20 to 25,000 people have left Crimea for the rest of Ukraine in the last year, primarily Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians. There have been a couple organizations that have been founded to help them reestablish their lives in Crimea, to help them gain access to their legal rights as Ukrainian citizens. The Crimean diaspora here, Crimea SOS, a couple organizations that run out of Kiev. And this is a picture from a Crimean Tatar restaurant that is now opened up in Lviv, in western Ukraine. It's sort of become maybe an unlikely destination for the Crimean Tatars. There have been many of them who have sort of ended up in Lviv and are now founding a small Crimean Tatar community there among the predominantly ethnic Ukrainians there. All right, so I have to say though that despite this increasingly oppressive environment in Crimea, its citizens, by all accounts, still appear to largely be happy with the outcome of the annexation last year. Right? There's been many images published since then of people celebrating, just earlier, a couple weeks ago, demonstrations in Simferopol and in Moscow celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the reunification. Right? There have also been a couple polls that have pretty much indicated that those referendum results are not as crazy as we might have all thought they were. Right? One conducted by geographers John O'Loughlin and Gerard Toll through the Levada Center, Russian surveying organization, conducted a poll in December and found that 84% of Crimeans view the annexation as absolutely the right decision. Right? With another, I think, 9% saying mostly the right decision. Right? So an overwhelming majority here agree with the outcome. Another poll conducted by this organization, GFK Ukraine, it's a German organization operating in Ukraine, found that 82% of Crimeans fully support Crimea's unification with Russia. And so while these numbers are a little lower than those 95 or so % figures from the referendum, it still seems pretty clear that, okay, well, maybe there's something to this, that a lot of people are really happy with this. One thing I would keep in mind when looking at these numbers is the fact that there's a law now in place in Russia that imposes heavy fines or imprisonment for anybody who's caught sort of voicing separatist opinions or any challenge to Russia's territorial integrity. Right? So it's unclear to what degree this has influenced the results from these polls, but I imagine there are at least some people who might not have said how they really feel out of fear of being called out and being punished for voicing an opinion other than the one that's expected of them with a poll like this. So it's a little hard squaring this for me personally, somebody who's been looking at Crimea for a while. It's kind of hard squaring these numbers with what I know about Crimea from previous polls and from some of the work I've done that I'll be talking about. So here are a couple of results from polls conducted in the years leading up to the annexation. Right? In 2008, the Razumko Center, the Ukrainian polling organization, found that 63.8% of Crimeans would opt for the region to join Russia. So still a majority, but far smaller than the numbers we've been seeing. But also 53.8% would preserve the region's status as an autonomous republic in Ukraine. This was a case where I think they could choose more than one answer in this question, because obviously those numbers don't add up. But another case, in two different polls conducted between one in 2011, one in 2013, between the two of them, we saw that those who believed Crimea should remain an autonomous republic within Ukraine grew from 49 to 53%, while those who believed that it should be separated and given to Russia shrank from 33 to 23%. Right, so accounting for this radical shift in public opinion is a topic that isn't the topic of this presentation. It's one that I think impels an investigation, though if I had to venture a guess, I'd say it has a lot to do with the sort of images and information that people in Crimea have been given by Russian media, by local authorities, right? These are some of the billboards that went up leading up to the referendum, right? It says on the March 16th referendum, we'll choose either, it's too dark to see, but it's Crimea with a swastika over it, right? Or bright shining future with Russia. So this feeds into these narratives that Russian media and Russian officials have been putting forward, that the authorities in Ukraine are now, this is this fascist junta, that they're out to get ethnic Russians, they're going to take away the rights of Russian speakers, that this is a serious threat to the Russian world and to Russians in Ukraine specifically. And this has been repeated and reinforced throughout the past year in numerous sources emanating from Russia. Right, so here's some people, right? Stop Ukrainian Nazism, no to fascism, right? This sort of belief that's really taken hold of many people, that to remain in Ukraine would be a serious threat to their very existence, right? Of course, everything that's been happening in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass, right, and the very violent conflict that's been going on there, only serves to sort of reify this belief. Well, they say, well, look what's happening in eastern Ukraine. That could have happened here if it weren't for Russia coming in on their white horse and taking us away before there was a chance for a conflict to really develop. Right? So looking at the situation in Ukraine from their perspective in Crimea through this prism that they have from the Russian media, we maybe begin to make sense of why there's been this radical change in the public opinion. So I want to sort of shift this to talking about some of the other narratives of justification that have been used in the annexation of Crimea. There's this one that okay, we needed to save ethnic Russians from this threat from Ukraine, but another major element to this was this argument that, well, Crimea is an inherently Russian place anyway. It was a historical mistake that it ended up in an independent Ukraine, right? The people there are inherently Russian, they belong to Russia, we're just righting a historical wrong by annexing it. So we see signs here, right? Russia and Crimea, we're together. Crimea, it's Russia. Crimea is Russian land, right? We also see use of this term, Rodina, or homeland, appearing in many places too. This is from a documentary that recently aired in Russia to sort of mark the anniversary of the annexation and to provide a narrative of how the annexation went down. This is the path to the homeland, right? So this idea that Crimea has returned to its homeland, right? It was estranged and now it's been reunified. So we see, it says, what's next? Who cares even if rocks fall from the sky? We're in our homeland. Again, that word, the Rodina, showing up. But keep in mind the use of that word Rodina, because I'm going to come back to it. So perhaps no one has been pushing these narratives more so than Vladimir Putin himself. Right? So I just want to read out this excerpt from his speech that he gave on May 18th of last year, immediately following the signing of the treaty to absorb Crimea. It says, everything in Crimea speaks to our shared history and pride. This is the location of ancient Khersones, where Prince Vladimir was baptized. The graves of Russian soldiers whose bravery brought Crimea into the Russian Empire are also in Crimea. This is also Sevastopol, a legendary city with an outstanding history, a fortress that serves as the birthplace of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Crimea is Balaclava and Kerch, Malakov, Kurgan, and Sakhmundrid. These are famous battle sites from the Crimean War and World War II. Each one of these places is dear to our hearts, symbolizing Russian military glory and outstanding valor. In people's hearts and minds, Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia. He also said, right, on December 4th of last year, Crimea, the ancient Khersones, and Sevastopol have invaluable civilizational and even sacral importance to Russia, like the Temple Mount in Jerusalem for the followers of Islam and Judaism. So really bringing in this sense of the sacred, and it being deeply, deeply rooted in their sense of identity and their sense of belonging as Russians. So a lot of what he said has fit very much in line with many of the Russian and Soviet narratives of Crimea. These are some that I spent time in my thesis sort of outlining. Different narratives coming from different ethnic perspectives about what Crimea is and what it means to different senses of national identity. So for Russians, those who identify as Russian or maybe still have a strong Soviet identity, some of the key elements to the story of Crimea, but the fact that this location, this place Kherson that Putin mentioned, which is a former Greek colony near Sevastopol. This is the place where Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus was baptized in 988, was sort of the inception of the Russian Orthodox Church in a way. Also various Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian versions of the Orthodox Church as well, but that sort of gets buried under the Russian narratives. All right, so this is a very important place for the Russian religious identity, and also the link to ancient Greece is an important element of sort of their civilizational DNA as well. So they see that link of having the Greek colony as being important to their sense of identity as well. Right? The defense of Sevastopol in both the Crimean War and World War II has given birth to the so-called Sevastopol myth about the glory of Russian military valor, and you see images here, paintings of the defense in various periods here. More so than any other site of battle that the Russian or Soviet army has been involved in, Sevastopol has come to symbolize sort of Russian and Soviet strength and sort of resistance against outside intervention and attack. Right? So if you visit Sevastopol today, it's basically a living shrine to Russian military glory. There's monuments on every corner. It's the Navy is pervasive there. It's really something to see. But an element that Putin didn't mention, is also an important element here, that's a little more populist in its character here, is the fact that, as I mentioned, Crimea was the premier Soviet tourist destination, right? It continued to be an important tourist destination after the Soviet Union, but it's because it was so heavily associated with sort of happier times in the Soviet Union when people could take their family to vacation in Crimea, when there were children's camps, there were sanatoria, there were all these lovely experiences had by people, millions of people from across the Soviet Union in Crimea. Right? And so it's become a very important site in the production of Soviet nostalgia in the post-Soviet period, and that's an important element for sort of the average person in Russia when they think about Crimea. But it's not the only narrative about Crimea. There's also the Crimean Tatar narrative, right? The fact, as I mentioned, their sort of ethnic composition coalesced from all these diverse peoples that have been left over in Crimea over sort of millennia of settlement. Right? So it was under the Crimean Khanate that they sort of developed a unified language and religion and sort of emerged as a single group. But they see that their very existence as being owed to sort of the geography and the history of Crimea itself, and it's from all the different people that they really came about. Right? The 3 centuries that Crimea spent under the rule of the Crimean Khanate is seen as a source of legitimacy for the Crimean Tatars being there. Right? Note that 300-year period is longer still than the entire period from now until the beginning of the Russian period there. Right? It's been less than 300 years since it was first annexed by the Russian Empire. So the Crimean Khanate was in power for longer than the Russians were. The forced deportation in 1944 that I mentioned is another very important element to the Crimean Tatar narrative of Crimea. This idea that they were ejected from their homeland and then spent much of their time in exile, maintaining this very strong and very persistent movement to be able to return to Crimea. Right? They petitioned the government. They held demonstrations on Red Square in Moscow. That guy Mustafa Jamilov, their leader, held what I believe is recognized as the longest hunger strike in history, where he went on hunger strike for a full year. It was force-fed in order to be kept alive, but he's a pretty remarkable man, actually. And so this idea that they were expected to sort of be assimilated into the local populations that they were resettled amongst in Uzbekistan and other places, but they resisted that. The connection to Crimea was a big part of that. And the struggles they've had upon returning and sort of trying to reestablish their lives have become an important part of this too. Right? There's a Ukrainian narrative as well, though they don't have as many sources of deep historical attachment to draw upon for their narrative. It has more to do with the period of independence, right? That's drawn out period of negotiation with between Kiev and Crimea to sort of negotiate the terms of their autonomy was a big deal, right? It's been argued by some Gwendolyn Sasse, a prominent Crimea specialist, that this was really the key to keeping Crimea out of conflict in the 90s, that there was this sort of give and take between Kiev and Simferopol to try to incorporate it into the state in a way that was amenable to Crimeans. Right? It's become a very important place in processes of Ukrainian nation state building as a result. And so it being so different, being the only region with the Russian majority, it's sort of seen as this high priority of trying to accommodate and to try to build Russia as a state of regions rather than some country that's just simply an ethnic Ukrainian state. There's also been narratives of Crimea as being beautiful, unique, and exotic. That's also an important element to these narratives here. Right? There have been early Orientalist tropes at the time when it was, Captain the Great was eyeing it for annexation. It was a sort of the height of European colonialism when Russia was interested in getting into the colonial game and saw this sort of exotic little subtropical mountainous peninsula sort of dangling there and saw it as something that they could incorporate and sort of legitimize them as an imperial power, right? It's also sort of thought of as a bit of a Garden of Eden at the time, right? Because of its climate and its diverse plant life and things like this, right? Russian poets and artists and many others have traveled there over the centuries, and there's been a very distinct sort of Crimean literary and aesthetic tradition that has emerged from this, right? And it's also been known as a place of tolerance. This is a picture I took in 2011 when I was there to illustrate this point. This is a group called the Mnogonacionalny Aktiv Crimea, so the multinational assets of Crimea. There was this group of young people, Russians, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, others who lived in the region, got together and did these groups, these demonstrations. This was called a friendly Crimea is a clean Crimea. So this effort to sort of pick up the trash and promote using garbage cans instead of just littering. And you see a sign here like throw away racism along with the trash too. Right? So it's very strong message of diversity and pride and place in Crimea. So Russian national narratives have seen a great resurgence, right? Those ones that I looked at have had a great resurgence in the period since last year, since Russia was annexed. But it has reified this perception that amongst Crimeans there's sort of a pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian identity binary, that people are either strongly pro-Russian or strongly pro-Ukrainian, or rather there's the majority who love Russia and wanted to return to Russia, and those few sort of provocative types who still cling to Ukraine. Right, but this has done a lot to obfuscate the alternative narratives, alternative national narratives that I've gone over from different national perspectives. It's also done a lot to hide the fact that there's a very strong, pervasive sense of regional identity in Crimea. Right, so my survey, I conducted in 2011, sample size of 798, reveals that attachment to Crimea is a much more salient component of regional identity than sort of an affinity for Russia or Ukraine. So I want to run through some of these results quickly here. So one of the things I asked in the survey was, how important are the following factors to your self-identity? Right, I said living in your town, living in Crimea, in Ukraine, Europe, or your Soviet past, as well as elements of sort of national identity. So nationality, language, and religious beliefs. And very quickly you can see, living in Crimea ranks highest among these various spatial factors, or the different scales of homeland or sense of place where they're living, right? Ranks highest among all of these, ranks up there with these elements of national identity too. So we see sort of that sense of national identity and sense of regional identity are both quite strong in the region among all groups here. Another thing I had them do on the survey was give them a blank space and I asked them to draw a map of their homeland, Rodina. Remember this term that's now been bandied about to talk about Crimea returning to a Russian homeland. Right? And I asked them to draw the homeland and to label the three most important places within it. Right, so I'll just throw a few slides here. This we see maps that sort of fall in line with what has been said recently, that Crimea is part of a larger Russian or Soviet homeland. Right, we see Russia, USSR, right, with Crimea occupying a prominent place in each of these. This one just says Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Russian Crimea. Right, didn't even bother drawing a map, just writing these three things that portray this very nationalist idea. Right? But many people also drew Ukraine. Right? We see here some of the maps of Ukraine. And again, note that Crimea is often much larger than it appears on real maps, and sort of emphasizing the importance of that region above all else. But I got a wide variety of scales here, from someone's garden, their neighborhood, their home, to the whole world. Right? So since this idea of homeland has a very broad interpretation, comes across in many ways. But what I found predominantly was that the majority of people drew just Crimea. That Crimea was far and away the single most common scale of homeland that people viewed. Which really challenges that idea that by rejoining Russia, Crimea has been returned to its proper homeland, when for most people, Crimea is already homeland unto itself. Right, so here's just a breakdown of the different scales that people drew these maps at. I'll draw your attention here to Crimea. For Russians, just about half of all the Russians that responded drew just Crimea. For Ukrainians, it's just over 40%. Note that 35.5% also drew Ukraine, so it's a stronger sense of attachment to the state of Ukraine among Ukrainians and other groups, while nearly 80% of Crimean Tatars drew their scale at Crimea. So there's, as I mentioned, a very deep historical attachment to Crimea among Crimean Tatars. Right, and getting to the heart of the matter, I asked a question on my survey. I remember this is a couple years before the Euromaidan, but I asked them, what should Crimea's political status be? And I gave them more options than they had on the referendum. I said, you could either remain an autonomous Republic of Ukraine, basically maintaining the status quo, lose their autonomy, but remain in Ukraine, become an oblast of Ukraine, join Russia as an autonomous republic, join it as an oblast, non-autonomous region, become independent or other. And so I broke it down by ethnic group here. As we can see, Russians definitely do favor joining Russia, predominantly, right? The red and the purple together are their responses for joining Russia, either as an autonomous republic or as an oblast. But note that about a quarter of them also would have chosen to remain in Ukraine. While among all the other groups, and I include others here that fall outside of these three groups, overwhelmingly chose to remain in Ukraine in one form or another, right? While a large chunk of Crimean Tatars also would have opted for independence. But I broke these down to make it a little more interesting in light of what's happened in the past year. I wanted to aggregate them, sort of try to guess what a vote might have looked like if the referendum had been held at the time of the survey. My survey sample was not exactly representative. Russians were a little undersampled, while the other groups were a little oversampled. So I weighted them when I aggregated them together to try to even that out and to try to give the proper weight to the different groups based on the 2001 census numbers. Right. So this is what comes out of this. I don't want to linger on this map or this graph for too long because I broke it down in some interesting ways here that really gets to the point here. So on the left is the preference for country, right? Either preferring Ukraine, either as an autonomous republic or an oblast, or preferring Russia as one or the other, with independence and other lumped in there. So we see that Russia does come out a little bit ahead, right? 45.5% versus 39%. There's still that question of the 15% who, not really sure how they would have voted. I've kind of crunched the numbers and tried to break it up and tried to guess which way different people would vote if they only had the option between Russia and Ukraine. And I came up with a number that suggested that the vote to join Russia probably would have come out ahead, maybe a few percentage points ahead, 53, 54% or so, right? So, true, there are strong pro-Russian sentiments in Crimea, but not nearly as sharp as they were presented in the referendum or in the polls conducted since annexation. But, importantly, I broke it up a different way this way, showing the preference for autonomy versus the preference for non-autonomy. So, these are all those that said they would want to be an autonomous republic either in Ukraine or Russia. These are all those who said they'd want to be an oblast in another country, and then independence in another. You can see a very overwhelming preference for autonomy versus non-autonomy for respondents here. And I have some quotes about sort of the importance of autonomy in Crimea from that scholar equivalence essay that I mentioned. So the territorial autonomy status acknowledges the political significance or distinct nature of a particular region. Often the ethnic composition of a territorial unit leads to demands for a special administrative or political status and cultural rights. Thus, autonomy can reinforce the link between ethnicity and territory. Multi-ethnicity can also become a stimulus for a special regional status. Crimea exemplifies both trends. It also says that Crimea's powers are politically weak and underdefined, and overall Crimean autonomy functions primarily at a symbolic level. So really what you're saying is that autonomy in Crimea hasn't really been very substantive. Lately there hasn't been a whole lot of regional powers that they've had, right? And rather that autonomy in Crimea represents sort of an acknowledgement of their distinct regional status, of their specialness, and the views of coming from all these different national perspectives, from Russian, Crimean Tatar, from Ukrainian, otherwise. So what this says to me is that Crimeans do view their region as special, and they do have this very distinct sense of regional identity, and they see autonomy as sort of a way of institutionalizing that sense of identity. And that this forms sort of a much more salient component of their identity than their preference for either Ukraine or Russia. So, to conclude here, so regionalism, at least prior to 2014, has formed a more salient basis of socio-spatial identities in Crimea than affinities for either Russia and Ukraine. The Crimeans largely understand the concept of homeland as tied to Crimea itself, but divergent national narratives and mythologies provide different lenses that filter their views of the region and inform their sense of attachment to Crimea. I also say that the events of 2014, which would include the Euromaidan, the annexation, and the continuing conflict in the Donbass, and especially the way that the Russian media has presented these events, has certainly sharpened, almost certainly at least sharpened pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian sentiments among the Crimeans. Though this does not mean that Crimeans identify neatly within the sort of pro-Russian, pro-Ukrainian binary that's sort of been presented. All right, and with that, I'll wrap up and I'll take your